Thanks for being here today. Just wanted to give you a 2-minute heads up. We'll start right at 2 o'clock. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Department of Water Resources for the Draft Groundwater Sustainability Plan Regulations Information Meeting and Webcast. Today, the department will be addressing Batch 3 issue topics for GSP regulation development. Thanks to those of you who are joining us here in Sacramento and many more who are on the webcast today. My name is Tanya Carlone. I'm a facilitator with the Center for Collaborative Policy based out of Sacramento State University. Today, the central purpose of the meeting, if you'll want to take a look at your agendas that you received via email or here in the room, the department will be providing information on Batch 3 issue topics in a very similar way to the way that they've done the previous 2 batches. And then the department would be interested in receiving your questions and comments related to the final 4 or Batch 3 issue topics, which include Topic 7, water budgets and coordination, Topic 8, state agency coordination, Topic 9, data collection, management and reporting, and Topic 10, adaptive management and focus areas. Also on the DWR SGM website, which is the link is here at the bottom of the page, and you will see that on the presentation as well. You can find those issue papers which go into greater depth. Just to give you a sense of our direction for the rest of the day, following the agenda review, Trevor Joseph, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Section Chief, will be giving a background, providing open remarks, giving SGMA background, and so on. Then we're going to take just a few minutes to go back to issue topic 4 because there's been a slight revision, and Trevor will go into that. Then Dan McManus with DWR will be talking about topics 7 and 9. And those 2 topics are combined today because they're very interrelated. All the topics are, of course, but these 2 particularly so. So we believe that's the most efficient way to approach those. Then topic 8, Rich Jurisic with DWR will be presenting this topic. And then on to topic 10, again, Trevor will make a presentation there, and then we'll close it out and talk about next steps, because this is the last meeting in discussing GSP regulation development. Thank you. Trevor?
Great. Thank you, Tanya. So as Tanya mentioned, today is specifically focused on Groundwater Sustainability Plan Draft Emergency Regulations. This is our 3rd public meeting webcast on this topic, not to be confused with public meetings that will take place in the future after we draft emergency regulations, and I'll get into the timing on that in just a minute. So again, as Tanya mentioned, a little bit on meeting purpose and timeline today. I'll go briefly over the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. I'll talk about California's groundwater briefly, what the department's doing as it relates to sustainable groundwater management implementation, our just approach to GSP regulations and outreach. Again, if you've attended prior meetings, this will all be familiar to you. And then today's focus will be on the regulation topics. We'll spend just a few minutes talking about some revisions to topic paper 4, the alternative GSPs. And then the majority of our time will be spent on topics 7, 8, 9, and 10 as laid out on the slide. Again, for those of you out there on the webcast, you can send comments or questions to this address, and we will interject those at the appropriate moments. Again, I show this slide every time, recognizing you can't read it every time, but this is a great visual in my mind to lay out all the major milestones related to SGMA. It is on our website and in our strategic plan. I encourage you to look at it and study it there if you're unfamiliar with the Act or new to the Act. Today, again, we're focused on Groundwater Sustainability Plan regulations, an activity that happens relatively early in the next 10 years, the next 10 years of implementation timeline here. And then this is nicely color-coded by who's the lead agency or the lead in terms of each of these activities, whether it's the state board, DWR, or local agencies. So I encourage you to look at this timeline. Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, I believe it was passed a year ago last Monday. So it's been a year since this act has been signed. It took effective January 1st, 2015. Some of the intent of the act, and this is paraphrased, but it provides sustainable groundwater it's the intent, legislative intent is to provide for sustainable management of groundwater, to enhance local management, to establish minimum management standards, to provide local agencies with authority and the tools and the technical financial resources to implement the act, although there's no financial resources in the act, to avoid or minimize subsidence, to improve data collection, to increase groundwater storage, and then there's that backstop, the state board, that should be used only when necessary. So some milestones for success kind of get broken out into three different major elements of the act. One is these groundwater sustainability agencies that must be formed by local agencies in all high and medium priority basins by June 30th of 2017. As of today, I believe there's 23 local agencies that have notified the department and are on our website listed as potential GSAs. Groundwater sustainability plans, again, what we're going to talk about in more detail today in terms of what is important in terms of looking at for the emergency regulations. But those plans must be prepared for high and medium priority basins by January 31st, 2020 for critical basins deemed critical condition of overdraft, and for all other high and medium priority basins by January 31st, 2022. And then there's a 20-year implementation period and a 50-year planning horizon, which are very important as it relates to the emergency regulations for plan development. The core features or elements of the act is around the term sustainability, and the act provides some definitions for sustainability goal, sustainable groundwater management, and sustainable yield. And within the sustainable yield definition, are these six undesirable results when they're at significant unreasonable levels related to seawater intrusion, water quality, groundwater levels, land subsidence, and depletion of surface water, and I'm not sure if I mentioned storage. So these really are at the heart of the act in terms of managing to avoid or minimize these undesirable results. California's groundwater, I think I just have a slide or two. Why is groundwater important? Makes up approximately 38% of the total supply, and this is based on 2005 to 2010 data. It's a much larger supply in drought years. Just some facts here that the Central Coast is the most groundwater dependent hydrologic region, and the Tulare Lake region uses the most groundwater. This act applies to 127 high and medium priority basins. There are more than that in the state. This map shows the 515 basins or sub-basins throughout the state. This map shows the high and medium priority basins shown in orange and red. Those are the basins where the act applies. Those basins are, it's required that they have a groundwater sustainability plan and manage groundwater sustainably. Those basins represent 96% of the groundwater supply in all 515 basins, and 88% of, again, the basin area, the 515 basins, 88% of the population overlying those basins. Just a quick plug for our DWR's strategic plan. This plan provides information as it relates to other activities and programs, projects that the department's working on related to sustainable groundwater management implementation. It's on our website. I'm not sure if we have copies outside today, but if it's on our website, and please encourage you to look at this if you're interested in other Sustainable Groundwater Management Act activities that the department's working on. This was also shown on that timeline you couldn't see, but I thought I'd highlight 4 items that are we've been actively working on, kind of early implementation items for the department. We are developing emergency basin boundary regulations. Those regulations have been submitted draft We're looking to finalize those regulations and adopt those regulations, have the commission hopefully adopt those regulations before the end of the year. Update basin prioritization. We're looking at doing this after the next publishment of Bulletin 118 in 2017. Basin subject to critical conditions of overdraft. We relooked at this information after it was last updated or detailed in 1980s, in the 1980 Bulletin 118 document. We've revised this list based on, obviously, a lot of time has transpired, and that public comment period closes the end of this week. And then, of course, we're working on the draft emergency regulations for groundwater sustainability plans, and that will be discussed in more depth today. And then finally, just a plug, I believe, for our website, where there's not just Sustainable Groundwater Management Act related programs and information, but also information related to Bulletin 118, our Groundwater Information Center, which has a lot of data and other technical information, and then our SGM program. So if you're interested in other groundwater related information, it's all there. All right, so again, for those of you who've been with us, we are called this our Summer of Outreach as it relates to the Groundwater Sustainability Plan regulations, and we've identified a series of topic papers that we wanted a lot of input on and share our thinking, and that has been part of our outreach process. So our communication and outreach strategy, it's pretty in-depth. We've been doing a lot of meetings and presentations, collecting a lot of feedback this summer, and we'll continue to do so after this summer. But we have a series of 11 advisory groups. I obviously won't go through all of them here. They're listed, including, in addition to the public meetings webcasts, of course, which we're here today going through. So we feel like we've done a lot of outreach. We've collected a lot of good information. This certainly was a process, or I should say this is a process we use with basin boundary emergency regulations, and we feel that it really paid off for us. We got a lot of information out of it. It really helped us make some informed decisions in terms of putting those emergency regulations together. So it's the same process, same groups, and we are working through that. So here's what it looks like as it relates to the Groundwater Sustainability Plan emergency regulations. We had some early scoping. We're in the second phase, this draft framework, working through these 10 topics. We will move towards the third phase here within a couple of weeks and really start to work on drafting the emergency regulations fall, winter of this year, and then work to adopt them before the June 1st, 2016 deadline next year. And again, something we presented at all of our meetings, but here's the 10 topics that were identified in our scoping process, that we have discussion papers on each of these topics, and we'll go through in detail 4 of them today and touch on alternatives as well. So again, just to flash this up for those on the webcast, if you want to send comments or questions as we work through.
So we can stop there for a second to see if there are any questions in the room about the background information that Trevor provided. So first in the room, and then we'll go to any email questions or comments about the presentation. Yes, we'll come to you.
Just a quick question. You mentioned there are so far 23 GSAs. Is there any goal to how many the state should have? Is it every basin should have it? How many basins per GSA? Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of the numbers, we really don't know exactly how many we'll get. So all of the 127 basins, those high and medium priority basins, it's required that they are covered by a groundwater sustainability agency, or groundwater sustainability agency notifies the department to manage groundwater for those basins. And there's different options GSAs, or local agencies can take in terms of doing so. One is they can cover one GSA completes one groundwater sustainability plan for the entire basin or sub-basin. Multiple GSAs can get together and form one groundwater sustainability plan for a basin or sub-basin, or multiple GSAs can develop multiple GSPs in a basin or subbasin with what's called an intra-basin coordination agreement. And so based on the variety, if you will, of options for local agencies, we really don't know how many GSAs we're going to foresee and notify the department. I think that we certainly will see more than probably 127. But the exact number, we're kind of curious what we're going to get. But by June 30th, 2017, if there's still white area, as it's claimed, unmanaged area, then the state board has the option of coming in and managing those areas. They have to identify within the next, what.
Thank you for that question. Any other questions in the room, again, about the presentation? Okay, thank you. How about any questions that have come in via email? All right, thank you.
All right, with that, I will start with topic 4. Now, we went through this on the second batch, last public meeting, and with our advisory groups. And we have some revisions to this topic paper. We've, I think, mischaracterized some things, and we wanted to clean that up. So this is straight from the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. I've highlighted some what I think are important pieces of this act that I want to focus in on. One is that there's 3 options, if you will, that a local agency can potentially use to submit an alternative to a GSP. So in certain cases, a local agency might have the option of utilizing these alternatives and not have to prepare a regular groundwater sustainability plan. As we talked about in the last public meeting, we feel that the technical requirements for submitting an alternative, which will be described in its own emergency regulation that we'll adopt by June 1st, 2016, but that the technical requirements are the same as a regular GSP. There was some discussion in terms of how we'd look at maybe regular GSPs and alternative GSPs if they were prepared in the same basin or subbasin. And reading through the act, it's pretty clear that the alternative needs to cover the entire basin. So that's the distinction that we kind of mismessaged. Wasn't always clear in prior meetings and in our discussion paper. So that's the important note, is that an alternative we feel must cover the entire basin or subbasin. And then these 3 options would still be potentially available to local agencies. And so I wanted to point out where that revision is. It's on our website. It's posted today. It's in red line strikeout, so you can clearly see where we've made some changes. But we wanted to draw that to everybody's attention. And again, we'll message that through our advisory groups. That, I will turn it over to topic 7 unless there's questions.
Yeah, just any clarifying questions. Just want to take a minute about the presentation on topic 4. Okay, so you can go ahead and take a look at those revisions online. Thank you. So moving on to topic 7.
Okay. So yeah, we're going to talk about topic 7, both water budgets and coordination, and then move right to topic 8, which is data collection and coordination. And once again, this is a somewhat abbreviated version of what's on the topic papers online. You can go online and get some more information there. And then also, we had a scaled down list of questions here. I think the full list is online, but they may also be here depending on what presentation I have. So we'll have to play with this a little bit. I'll just advance it like this. Okay, so one of the things I want to start right off with is just talk a little bit about the some of the gaps and challenges we see with the water budgets and coordination. And really, when we look at SGMA, there's a little bit of a gap between what SGMA requires the GSAs to do as far as data collection, and then what it also says that the department must do in order to evaluate if GSAs will be achieving a sustainability, they'll sufficiently coordinate sharing and data and methods, and that they will not adversely affect sustainability goal of adjacent GSPs. Other challenges, of course, is the one size, doesn't fit all in this situation. And so that's really identifying what the appropriate level of standards would be and water budget requirements when you have such a wide range of basin conditions and variables going on in the field. So those are a couple of the challenges just off the top. Looking at the water code, as far as the definitions, the intent, and the findings, those are some of the things we look to really help guide us in development of the regulations. And it does provide a definition of water budget, and that's the total accounting of water, groundwater, and surface water entering and leaving the basin, including the changes in the amount of water stored. And so in looking at some of the findings, they declared that the information on the amount of groundwater extraction, natural and artificial recharge, groundwater elevations are critical for the effective management of groundwater. And then some of the other findings there is really to ensure then require the development reporting of those data necessary to support sustainable management and those data necessary to resolve disputes regarding sustainable yield, beneficial uses, and water rights. Some other legislative intent, and Trevor went through these, so I can kind of skip through them, but obviously we want to provide sustainable management, but with respect to data collection and water budgets, we really want to establish the minimum standards for sustainable management. We want to improve data collection and understanding about groundwater. And then, of course, the definitions, that there is a definition of sustainability goal. It defines the sustainability goal in terms of sustainable management, and then they do provide a definition for sustainable groundwater management, and essentially that's management that won't cause the undesirable results. And Trevor went through those 6 undesirable results, and here they are again. And so really our challenge and the challenge of the GSAs is for them to develop plans that address undesirable results and avoid those undesirable results whenever possible. And the challenge for us is to make sure the regulations are written in a way that we receive enough information that we can make that assessment as well. So that'll be a little bit of a challenge. And of course, some other water code, I'll drag you through a little bit here, and this just is the part that says, the regulations will definitely include those sections of the water code. 727.2 is a list of, having measurable objectives and description of the basin, that type of thing. 727.4 are the other options that with the AB 3030 plans used to be optional. Now they're not. And then the 1027.6 is relating to the coordination requirements. And then in addition to those, this just says that the department, and kind of to help out with this, are going to identify appropriate methods and assumptions for baseline conditions concerning hydrology, water demand, and regulatory restrictions. So that's an assignment that's on us, and that has to kind of dovetail with what we're going to be requiring with the water budget. And so we're looking for ways to provide some of those standards, methods, so people can do their analysis. So just exactly what does the water code say about reporting to DWR? As far as GSAs reporting to DWR, there's 5 items that that's listed that they have to report: groundwater elevation data, aggregated annual data as far as their extractions go, surface water supply, total water use, and change in groundwater storage. And then if you look at also, it has a requirement for adjudicated basins reporting to DWR. And it's pretty much the same requirements, except for they've added they have to submit their annual report that they also submit to the court. And then water budget and coordination. This is the other section I mentioned where if you are going to have 2 or more groundwater sustainability plans within the same basin, the code clearly spells out that you need to coordinate on a number of things, and it's data and methods and assumptions for these items here, and that's groundwater elevation data, extraction data, surface water supply, total use, change in storage, water budget, and sustainable yield. So it does mention the need to coordinate on water budget information if you're within, if you're forming a plan, 1 or two or more plans within the basin, but also we're looking at this for adjacent and hydraulically connected basins. We figure, those probably have the same importance as if you had two plans within the same basin. So water budget requirements, this is where the challenge gets in for us to kind of outline what might be required there. As we mentioned, not all basins are the same. Some are more aggressively managed. Some are much less aggressively managed. They don't have as much water supply. So for those basins, maybe more of a basic approach would be appropriate, where we look at the some basic factors for inflow and outflow and change in storage. I think for some basins this could work out, but then there are other basins where they are managing a little more actively, and they're going to need a more comprehensive analysis. It looks at all the different systems, including the groundwater system, breaks that out, the land surface system, looking at the urban agricultural land use, managed wetlands, and then the interaction of the stream and surface water systems with that land use system, and then also the climatic system. So a budget that breaks all those out and then also looks at the interrelationships of those. Where's your imported water coming from? How much is going to deep perk? All those interactive arrows that goes into that. As far as water code, again, this is another section of the code that we're interested in, and this just says that similar to before, it lists the code requirements that we have to include, but then also it talks about if there are multiple plans within the basin, they have to have a coordination plan. But then it's the final thing, number C here, that we look to, and it says the department shall evaluate whether a groundwater sustainability plan adversely affects the ability of adjacent basin to implement their sustainability plan. And so when we're looking at maybe what the needs are for groundwater budget and data analysis and reporting, we want to make sure that we're getting enough data that we fully understand what's going on in that basin and how it may affect those trying to do management in adjacent and hydraulically connected basins or within that same basin. So there are a number of questions, and I apologize, I sent Trevor a presentation that was an older version. I thought I sent him my updated one. So this one has the full complement of our probably 15 questions, which I don't think we want to go through all those today. I don't know.
Be able to bring up the other one.
Do we have the other one on here? Because I think that would probably better to throw that on and just work through the abbreviated version.
The agenda, why I bring that up.
So while they're working this through, for those of you who are in the room, I would just point to the back of the agenda, and you can see where some of those the questions that we'd like to look at. You can take a look at them now and get a sense of any answers or responses you might like to bring forward. And we'll just...
So
well, I think, Dan, are you busy with this? Are you busy doing this? You can, okay. Yes, of course. We're recording, so we need to do this via microphone.
Yeah, Frank Ramirez, National American Indian Veterans, National Director of Governmental Affairs. On looking at the different groundwater areas, and some are aggressive, some are not, is there any way for government to take a look at those areas that are in deep, deep problems, like Tulare County, Porterville area? I know I've talked to some farmers that are drilling over 3,200 feet for wells, getting a lot of water, but they're going to drain folks that have wells that are 200 or 300 feet in depth. And they're in deep trouble now, but with some of these farmers just putting in some super deep wells, it's going to really suck up the waters in the aquifer.
And so the specific question there was...
Is there any way for government to say, okay, if, let's say, for example, and I don't know if Tulare County is doing that, if Tulare County is not aggressively looking at their groundwater management, is there a place for outside government to come in, particularly in the Porterville, Ducor area, where probably the majority of the wells that are going dry are there, and adjacent farmers are drilling in excess of 3,000 feet.
Yeah, so currently, the counties, typically Department of Environmental Health has authority over well drilling. So if they wanted to, they could pass an ordinance that limited the well drilling in that area, or restricted the capacity wells or the well spacing in that area. As far as SGMA goes and sustainable management, once if an area hasn't developed a GSA, and it hasn't been designated for a GSA, the state board can come in at that point and take over the basin as a probationary basin or an unmanaged basin, and then later on, if they're unable to achieve the goals they set out in their plan, once again, the state board could come in as a probationary basin. So I think there's some things that the counties could probably do now, and then as time moves on. I don't know if you guys have any more. Okay, and did we?
Dan, I'm sorry, the memory stick, I updated the version as well. So we don't have the older version, I apologize.
No,
But
it's fine.
here's the questions. I'm not sure if we can,
And I've got them on here too, and so what I might do is just go to my handout, so I don't have to take you through all these. But one of the first questions we want to ask you, and we kind of culled through, and like I said, online there's probably 15 different questions. What we want to do, we distilled those down to about 5 or 6 to go over with you. And what types of water budget information will the GSAs need to collect? And this is in reference to the data collection part of things. And really, I apologize again. This presentation didn't go into the data collection side of things, but really, if you look at the issues are almost identical. The water code, as it addresses data collection, is almost identical. So there's really only about 3 slides there that just talked about the similarities between the data collection and the water budgets. So the question we'd like to throw out is given the need for GSAs to be able to manage in a way that avoids undesirable results, or if you have undesirable results, to either mitigate or stop those from occurring, what type of data would you need to be collecting? And some of the things we threw out for suggestions were population, land use, irrigation methods, applied water source, precip, well location, well construction. I'm not sure if folks have any input on other things that might be needed.
So anyone in the room, any ideas about what types of water budget information GSAs will need to collect? Yeah.
Well, I can tell you some of the feedback we received on that. And really, when we asked some of our advisory groups what the same question, what data should be collected, and they saw the laundry list of things we were thinking about. One of the things they said is that the GSP, the sustainability plan, really must be founded on sound conceptual models and knowledge of data availability and needs regardless of the requirements. So what they're saying there is it's almost as important for the GSAs to get a really thorough understanding of how the basin's working, understand the different components there, how they're interrelated, before they start really determining, the checkoff box of what data needs to be collected. So, once again, I think they're saying in the regulations, don't focus so much on the prescriptive detail, but more on the outcome of what's going to happen for that area. Also, one of the comments we heard is requirements should not divide the water budget reporting into too many small pieces. That could be trouble for the locals to collect that much data. But it must be sufficiently detailed to demonstrate sustainability. And that, obviously gets back to the needs of our department to understand what's going on there. And then the other comment, which I thought was interesting, is because there's some discussion of the quality of the data. As you get 127 potentially different, people collecting data, the quality can be quite variable. And so there's some comment there that there's some incentive for good quality data and good data collection, and that will come from the local taxpayers, because the assumption is that at some point the GSAs will probably be charging fees to manage their data management, and that the people they're charging those fees to are going to want to see the results of that data collection and understand that data they're collecting is the most meaningful and can help out. So With that, I don't know if there's any other feedback.
So I'd like to check in because we're still focused on that first question. Is that right, Dan?
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to make sure that we're checking in via email as well. Have we had any questions come in about what types of water budget information GSPs would need to collect?
There is one question. Let's see. Aside from the water board, and this may be peripherally related and maybe tied in further on, but might as well ask it now. Aside from the state water board taking on a role if necessary, there's not been a mention of a role for regional water boards in the sustainable groundwater management process. Has there been any conversation regarding regional water boards' role in this arena?
That's a good point. And I certainly, as far as the some of the water quality objectives, I think it makes sense to bring the regional board in. And through working with the state board, we're assuming there's some coordination there, but with the regional boards also. But yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I guess we could do a little.
Yes, Frank, I'm sorry. We have to do this because we're recording.
Just real quickly, on the private wells that are going dry, maybe collecting in terms of total number of wells and how many are going dry would be interesting to have, because I know in Tulare County, probably the most wells that have gone dry in the state of California are in kind of the southern and eastern part of that county. So data that would say how many private wells are there and how many have gone dry.
Yeah, and I think that's starting later last year, that was a piece of information that the counties were trying to collect with the help of some of our regional offices. If our regional office got reports through the request for well logs, we would also supply that to the county, and the county in turn was reporting that to OES. And I believe fairly soon we're actually going to have an interactive website where it's going to show where those clusters are of dry well reporting. I asked for that last week, and I don't think it's up yet, but I think that tool is being developed. So it's a good suggestion. I think it's one that's being worked on. Well, let's move on, and I guess we'll try to ignore the questions on the screen because I'm going to tell you.
Okay,
verbally.
so you'd like to just go through these questions? Okay, so let's get something via email, and then I'll bring us through.
You want to take one more online?
Yes, we're going to go with online.
Okay, so this one is pertaining to water budgets. Water budget component estimates typically have a material degree of error, particularly when they are made without a groundwater model. Significant resources can be spent to develop water budget details, but at the same time be left with considerable uncertainty. Will DWR provide guidance on managing uncertainty?
We will, as far as identifying, the baseline methods and assumptions that they need to consider as far as their hydrology and their cutbacks. So, those all get to reliability and uncertainty. So we will be outlining some of the information the locals need to consider when evaluating their future supply reliability. And that information then will have to be rolled into the water plan in order to be able to make sure you're assessing the proper data.
Just to add on to that one, a follow-up question from someone else. What about the minimal acceptable spatial and temporal resolution for monitoring with respect to that uncertainty? I think
we are going to provide some direction there, and without being too prescriptive, we realize there is still a need to provide some minimum level of standards. So, and a question we're going to get to in a little bit here is we're looking at potentially looking at the basins in a kind of a tiered approach based on the number of undesirable results they have happening there. Of course, they have to be significant and unreasonable, but if you have subsidence occurring, if you have seawater intrusion, if you have a number of things occurring, your level of requirements for your water budget would probably be a little bit higher than those basins that currently have more limited demand and they're more in balance with the way they're operating.
Okay, thank you. Was there something else there, Tim?
Apparently we're having some technical difficulties online where the audio is cutting in and out, so maybe just try and talk directly into the mic,
Okay.
and
Okay.
Hong's going to follow up with it, see if we can clarify if it's something beyond our control here. But just
Okay,
to give you a
thanks for
heads up.
informing us of that, and thanks for your patience, those of you who are on the webcast. So, Dan, it seems as if we have moved on to this question, what is the appropriate spatial and temporal resolution of monitoring? You've spoken a bit to that. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about that, both in terms of context and or any feedback that you've received from the advisory groups in that regard?
Well, yes, I have some feedback right here. So feedback, some of the things we heard from our advisory committee as far as the spatial and temporal resolution was DWR should allow different resolutions depending on the basin needs and challenges, which is kind of what I was just talking about. If you've got a lot of issues going on in the basin, obviously you need to dial in on your temporal and spatial monitoring. The other comment we heard was do not require monthly time resolution just because the board may need that down the road if the basin goes into probation. There's another list of requirements that people have to report, and that is if the basin goes to probationary status and they end up reporting to the board. And those are, it's a longer list and it's monthly requirements for data. And this comment is just saying, don't go to monthly data just because the board may need that later. And then the other comment here was that generally monthly resolution rather than annual is very important. So we also get, conflicting comments back and forth, and that people are, in some ways feeling like providing monthly information is a much better way for them to be able to describe the situations that are occurring in their basin versus just an annual aggregate number. So those are some of the feedbacks we heard on that question.
Okay, thank you. And in the room, if you have any comments or responses to that question about what is the appropriate spatial and temporal resolution of monitoring before we do move on to the challenges question. Anything coming in? Okay, so let's move on to what challenges will GSAs face in collecting, managing, reporting, and sharing water budget data. Anything you'd like to say about that, Dan?
Right. And the idea here is, I talked a little bit about if you have 2 or more groundwater management plans within the same basin or in adjacent hydraulically connected basins, you have a pretty high bar for what you're going to be able to share or what you're going to need to share with those other plans so that you're not working towards, divergent goals, so to speak. And so the questions are, what are some of the challenges with sharing that data and collecting, managing, and reporting that data? Some of the things we heard is that standardized approaches are really needed, but shouldn't overwhelm the locals or be too prescriptive. So the idea there is providing some standards for locals to use, but not getting too detailed with that. It's saying standard units and metadata should be strong requirements. Another comment we heard was transparency of the data submitted and or collected is essential, but will take education and outreach in order for people to really get comfortable with sharing data that they haven't shared before. And then the other comment was growers would be okay with reporting extraction data if it's aggregated and not on the field scale. So, it says, but the request for higher transparency at the state level could result in less cooperation with the local GSAs. So I don't know if there's any thoughts on some of those, either that question or the feedback associated with it.
Any thoughts or questions related to the challenges that GSAs face, either your own response there or reactions or responses you might have to any of the feedback that Dan brought forward? First in the room. Okay, anything coming in online?
Yeah, we have a couple of items. Let's go back to the first one. So another question in regard to resolution of, data being collected. A request, are we talking about resolution at a square mile or sub-acre basis? So do we have a feel for the scale we're looking at?
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty variable. Clearly if you're trying to identify surface water groundwater interaction, having your monitoring a mile away is not going to cut it. So there are situations where I think monitoring a closer proximity is going to be needed. A little bit, once again, depends on what's happening in that basin. If you have a groundwater depression, you're really trying to manage, and also if there are contamination plumes in that basin that you're trying to not mobilize or aggravate, you may need some additional density there. But I guess right now all we have are kind of generalities, in that the data should be collected at a sufficient scale in order for folks to be able to manage their basin sustainably.
We have a question in the audience, I believe.
Yes. Sorry, we're having blinking lights and some technical issues today.
Hey, it's the last one, so why
Yes.
not throw it all at me? I'm ready.
I think we're talking about two things. I mean, the collection versus the reporting.
Right.
I think you have to collect at the greatest resolution you can afford, or that you have to comply with already. For example, a water district has to report at the point of diversion to the state board for water rights. At the very end of that scale, there's the SB 7X requirements to say how much are you diverting to the farm scale. And your water budgets, especially in conjunctive use environments, are only going to be as good as the data in terms of where all the water is delivered and what happens to it from the point of diversion to the point of delivery. So the level of resolution and collection should be as great as any of the water districts or areas can afford, and meet multiple requirements. Now, how that gets reported on a water budget sub-area so that it's easier to understand by people and it produces usable public information is a different duck. And I know there's a big issue around confidentiality and all of that, but I think creating a distinction between collection and that resolution and reporting and how that data is aggregated is really part of what the regulation has to address.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we're not trying to imply that that you're going to need to report at the same scale that you're collecting the data. We certainly know that there's going to be a higher resolution with the monitoring than there is with the reporting. But that is a good segue to our next question, if we're ready to go.
Yes, so looking again at the questions, those of you in the room may be looking at your agenda. Should the requirements for water budget accounting and reporting include a tiered level of data collection and reporting based on the occurrence and level of undesirable results within the basin or a sub-area within the basin? So Dan, any context you want to provide there, the feedback you've received thus far, and then we'll look to questions from the audience and then online.
Sure, and this is addressing the exact thing we were just talking about. Is there are some basins where potentially 80% of the groundwater use falls in 20% of their area. So with those basins, I mean, just providing an aggregate reporting doesn't shed a whole lot of light on how that maybe 20% is being managed for that 80% of use. So anyway, the question is about a tiered approach for providing information, and really a tiered water. One of the feedbacks we heard is tiered water budget data reporting should consider whether the undesirable result stems from inadequate understanding of the basin versus inadequate or ineffective management of the basin. And with that, we're talking about the fact that if you have more undesirable results occurring there, you'd have to collect a higher level of information. The comment here is really just getting to the point that they may not have a whole lot of information to go by to know. They may say that, hey, we don't have subsidence, but yet if they're not monitoring subsidence, they're not going to know that. So there's a question there as to just making sure that, what the lack of understanding is of the basin is from, whether it's from they're just not managing it correctly or whether data is not being collected. Secondly, we need to first identify significant unreasonable before determining the sufficient level of water budget complexity. And that's a good point also. We're kind of looking at some processes for doing that. And that's, once again, as you can imagine, it's a pretty tricky task to define significant unreasonable for multiple types of basins in multiple areas. So, but clearly I think we need to have a better handle on what that is before we can translate that into what data is required to be collected and reported.
Any responses or thoughts in the room, particularly pertaining to that tiered approach? Should the requirements for water budget accounting and reporting include a tiered level of data collection and reporting based on the occurrence and level of undesirable results in the basin or sub-area of a basin? Anyone in the room have thoughts, further questions, any comments associated with that, a tiered approach? And, okay, good, we got a thumbs up. And how about online? Any questions or comments?
This might relate to the previous question, but could fold into the tiered approach as well. Rather lengthy, so bear with me. What thoughts does the department have about evaluating whether or not a plan in Basin A impedes the sustainable management in adjacent Basin B? For example, if a plan in Basin A results in reduced flow into Basin B could argue that the reduced flow will lead to undesirable results. Basin A could argue that pumping and other factors are causing considerable undesirable results. Who is right? How does DWR develop thresholds to determine when plans begin to impact the sustainable management in adjacent basins?
Yeah, so I mean, it's one of those things where it's a little bit of a circular loop in that I think we'd be asking, the locals obviously to develop their own sustainability goals. And so it depends on what the goals are for each of those basins and what they're trying to achieve. And then, as part of the regulations too, there's going to need to be coordination agreements, and you can't develop those separately. It's a coordination agreement. So these two basins are going to have some discussions with each other and say, hey, our goal is to capture every drop of, water before it leaves our basin. That could be a problem with their neighbor, and they would have that discussion up front when they're trying to figure out each other's, goals and how to not interfere with those. So from the department standpoint, we'd be clearly having some minimum standards there for making sure there's no impact, but really be requiring and relying on the locals to, establish those coordination agreements that make it clear for us to be able to understand when those are being impacted.
Anything else online? Tim or Heather? Okay, just checking back in the room. Any other questions? Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the question related to groundwater models. Should they be required for water budget analysis and forecasting? And again, Dan, if you want to talk about that a little bit and about the feedback you've received thus far, and then we'll go.
And I think, when you look at SGMA, it's got some pretty lofty requirements there, and especially when you look at the surface water groundwater interaction, and that's one of the things that is pretty difficult to monitor for, and oftentimes you supplement your monitoring with modeling. And so the question was that we're getting is are models then going to be required for all these basins? And the feedback we heard is that models will be useful for informing complex basin operations, particularly when considering varying climate conditions. That's the other thing that has to happen, is you have to kind of forecast your water supply reliability. So models are really good for that. The other thing we heard is that models can be multiple things. You can have a spreadsheet analysis can be a model. So maybe for those basins that don't have as many issues or are operating more closely to their sustainable management, maybe even a simple spreadsheet analysis of their budget could be okay. So it's kind of a little bit back and forth. I think ultimately, the department's looking too for how we can help out in the Central Valley anyway with providing some improvements to our C2V SIM model, or clearly the GS has a model there too, so that maybe we could help locals in not starting from ground zero on a model if they really want to develop one. So we're looking into that and looking for feedback.
Yes, I think we have a comment in the room here. Hong, thank you.
I think you need to create an educator around the distinction between a numerical model and an analytical solution that would be like a spreadsheet, which is a water budget that doesn't really involve the hydrodynamics of how the basin actually operates. And I think it's critical to create that awareness. If there is a model that exists like in the Central Valley, especially something that's been calibrated and developed regionally to deal with the issues of regional boundary inflow, I think that has to be a basis of discussion to start a dialogue, because most of those budgets are prepared at those sub-basin scales. And there's going to be conflicts between the models. But the value of that dialogue is in discussing the quality, availability, the data that went in, the knowns, the unknowns. What are you most or least sensitive to? Because that development process can be facilitated and have a good dialogue about what is known and what's not known, and the quality of information you have and where those gaps are. And that can be very productive in a basin. So I would say groundwater modeling, it can take a long time, it's very expensive, and it's not necessary if you don't have one already. It should be necessary to consult if you have one. You can develop great spreadsheets, models as a first cut to really get people dialoguing and talking about whether they need a model or not, and then move forward from there.
Good feedback.
Thank you. Other thoughts related to the using groundwater models in the room? Let's go to online feedback.
So again, I'm going to step back to the previous question. We have a little lag with email here. So however, a valuable comment. Seems that a tiered approach could easily become self-serving for areas that don't want to report. In other words, low resolution data will not show the 6 undesirable results that high resolution may show. So having some level of minimal resolution will likely become pretty important to make sure that the state accomplishes what it's trying to achieve. We'd support high resolution data both temporally and spatially. So some support there.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I think our department is looking, like I said, for ways to provide some of that regionally. So we have map subsidence. We know in general where that's occurring, so that when we ask the question, in your regulations for your GSP, do you have subsidence in your area? A little hard to skirt that these days when we have the LiDAR. Some of the other issues, yeah, there may be a factor of scale there. They may be able to get around it, but the bottom line is I think there'll be a minimum level of monitoring required that should show up if it hasn't shown up already. And so eventually that'll be self-correcting is the way I see it.
Anything else that's come in, Tim?
Yes.
Okay.
This question, if a producer is extracting water in a white area with possibility of recharge beyond, with no possibility of recharge beyond precipitation, is that producer basically considered finished as far as meeting sustainability requirements?
Yeah, so the sustainability requirements for the basin as a whole, so, it depends a lot on what's happening surrounding that individual. If he's surrounded by a surface water district that's applying flood water, they may be okay. But certainly if you have that scenario played out across the basin, yeah, that's not going to work. So it's going to be really variable depending on what the exact situation is in the basin.
Okay. Other online questions or comments, Tim?
Sure. Yeah, we'll keep going. We got a few.
Okay, keep on going.
So an aside question. What will be the approach for overlaying 2 or more public entities under the same area, taking consideration that 2 entities want to take active part in the GSA? How will it be decided who will take the role as the GSA in the lead or in the area? You want to address GSAs a little bit?
Yeah, so the water code doesn't really direct the department to make those decisions, and we have recently had some changes with SB 13 was just recently passed, and it does now prohibit overlapping GSAs within a basin, and there are some other aspects of that regulation we're trying to still look at and work through. That regulation is not going to take effect until January, I believe. So yeah, it could pose some challenges, but once again, we're requesting that people get together early rather than late. And we do have some facilitation funds available for folks they want to have that discussion as to how best to manage within their area and not have overlap and still be able to all achieve, you know, their management goals. I don't know.
No, I mean, SB 13 was just passed very recently. There's also some additions to SB 13 in terms of local agencies not exceeding their service area. There is a requirement now that they submit complete notices to the department. So we need a little time to look at that and figure out exactly how we're going to approach some of those provisions. But again, as Dan pointed out, GSA formation really is a locally driven activity, and the department has some limits in terms of our role and in terms of accepting certain GSAs over other GSAs and so forth.
Okay, next. So this one is back to data collection, specifically temporal resolution. So will DWR's guidance include seasonality of when water levels are collected? For example, the highest and lowest water levels for Central Valley occur at different times of the year than they occur in the coastal agricultural basins. If water levels are not at peak or low, you may miss.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing. We certainly want to catch the highs and lows of the basin. So, and those are variable. When we try to do our change in storage just within the Central Valley, we saw, you know, highs ranging from January, February, you know, in the south all the way up to April, May in the north. So, but you're right. I mean, we do need some consistency. We want people to be catching those peaks, and so there would be some requirements there to do that.
Thanks. So the next one, how does the state plan to organize, summarize, and aggregate the data from 100 plus reporting groups?
And so we haven't, you know, we've discussed that a little bit, not in a lot of detail, but certainly we want to aggregate it in a way that's meaningful to our other planning efforts. And we have the California Water Plan that looks at data by hydrologic region and by planning area and by detailed analysis unit. And then we have our groundwater basin. So probably it'll be a combination of rolling up the groundwater basin data by hydrologic region so that it fits in with our planning document in the California Water Plan. And then, you know, that data would also be reported in Bulletin 118. That would, yeah, okay.
So we've asked enough questions here that we've caught back up to the current modeling question. Okay. And so we'll run one by you on this. DWR has noted that the baseline range years are 1989 through 2009. Some groundwater models for local entities have different year ranges for data than what was noted by DWR. Developed groundwater models may have chosen a range that spans the same number of years or more, but are different due to being data-rich years locally. Would this pose as an issue for the groundwater models that had been developed and calibrated using different baseline years?
Yeah, and so the baseline years you're referring to are something we put together when we were looking at the basin subject conditions of critical overdraft. And we wanted to pick a series of years that was greater than 10 years, that included both dry and wet periods. And when we scoured through and looked at it and consulted with our state hydrologist, that set of years was pretty good. I mean, actually, at the end of there, I think the average values for that whole period were real close to the average over the long term. And so that's the data, that's that interval that we were using to evaluate the basin subject to conditions of critical overdraft. It's not necessarily the same base period we're going to use for folks to look at when they are setting up their forecasting scenarios for their modeling. You know, it could be some group of those same years, but clearly, and we got to try to find a way to bring in some of this more recent information, which is going to be a challenge because they're drought years. But we're sitting down looking at the baseline data requirements, and it'll be it'll be something that it'll be written in a way that won't be too prescriptive once again, but it will allow the locals to have some flexibility to identify that for their area.
Okay, I'd like to bring it back to the room because there have been a lot of questions that have come in via the webcast to make sure that there are no other comments here before we move on to the next question. Yes.
Has DWR had a chance to look at what the evidentiary record is and requirements have been for the different adjudications to say how they've done it maybe with an analytical model versus a numerical model, or what type of data submittal and standards have been required to be put in front of a judge? It's not the first time we've been through this kind of conflict resolution, but we're doing it outside of that adjudicatory process right now. So is there any review of the methods that have been required by, sitting jurists to talk about data and because you got the language common methods, data, and assumptions. What has been acceptable in those environments where adjudicated have resulted in better management of the groundwater basin?
Yeah, and I think that would be a good effort. There's some ongoing, there's some surveys out right now that people are looking at that information. Clearly with the adjudicated basins, we're soon going to be getting the annual reports for those areas. We want to look at those and see what's required and how they're doing management. But we have not done a comprehensive analysis of all the adjudicated basins. And the other thing to remember, the adjudicated basins, they weren't, they're I guess their management isn't predicated on sustainability, really. It's predicated on safe yield, which in some cases, isn't quite the same thing that we're looking for with sustainable management. But they would have some overlap in their approaches.
The same could be applied for CEQA and the building of an administrative record pursuant to CEQA, because CEQA does become key because the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act does bring sustainable into that discussion. So all the discussions around thresholds of significance in administrative record, through something like a CEQA process as compared to an evidentiary record being built for litigation. Those are two models to look at to say, or caution at least people that are planning in a basin, that your urban water management plans, your subsequent CEQA land use decisions, whether for a general plan or an area plan, are going to be predicated on how good your analysis is to be able to make your findings and evidence. So that administrative record is another example of where you might consider the level of resolution and detail necessary to address the conflict.
Good point.
Thank you for that meaningful feedback. I'd like for us to go ahead and continue with these last two questions since we're running short on time, and I want to ensure that we get through the other topics. So if you could take these both one after the next, Dan, and let us know the feedback that you've received thus far, and then we'll go ahead and put the question to the group as well as to those online. So the two questions that we'll be looking at right now: what data sets should the state provide that could be used by all GSAs to support development of groundwater sustainability plans? And would it be helpful for GSAs to categorize and report water budget data by basin sub-areas relating to water demand, supply reliability, or land use? So take us through those two, and then we'll open it up.
So we mentioned the state, it's part of SGMA written right into it, is the state will provide technical assistance, and we're realizing that, with the standards and methods and some of this data, it is better to have some regional information available for all folks. So the feedback we received on data sets is that it would be helpful if the state could provide land use data, at a regional scale, subsidence data, stream monitoring information, climate change, future scenarios, and that would be identifying what are the scenarios that need to be looked at for forecasting their water supply reliability, and then water levels, regional scale water levels, and potentially things like population and ET. Those are some of the things that were thrown out that would be helpful if the state provided those. And if people want to comment on that, they can. And then as far as the water budget and data collection, and this is really getting back to, I probably misspoke earlier, but the situation where you have a basin where you have a real difference in how the land use activities in the basin and the water supply. So you may have all your groundwater concentrated in one portion of the basin. Is it helpful to focus reporting for that area, break it up? And some of the feedback we heard there was that the level of detail and problematic parts of the basin can be vastly different from other areas in the same basin, which to me that comment seems to support the need for having some sub-area reporting. And then also it says need to consider if reporting by smaller water use areas will really allow for an improved understanding of the basin. I don't know if there are any comments or thoughts or feedback on those two.
Great, thank you, Dan. Let's start in the room. Any comments or further questions about data sets to support GSPs, or the final question there, would it be helpful for GSAs to categorize and report water budget data by basin subareas relating to water demand, supply reliability, or land use? Yes.
Hi, just hoping you could elaborate a little on that request for land use data and ET data. Is the department considering finding a way to make that available so that that would be one part of the puzzle that's provided?
Yeah, so just a little bit of feedback, and we started, once again, from our perspective, is really the evaluation of the basin and whether they're achieving sustainability. And so, we started looking at some of the way groundwater is managed in particular basins, and like I said, where there is a really concentrated use in just one portion of the basin. The concern is if they report as an aggregate value and they report all their water levels, in an aggregate way, and they're pumping in an aggregate way, without any other information to really understand where that groundwater is coming from, we might have a hard time evaluating whether that's sustainable. And so this could be an opportunity for the locals to better describe their situation and their management practices for sub-region within that same basin. So it's a little bit of both. We're still thinking about the pros and cons of that from both our standpoint and for the local standpoint. Clearly, it's a more discretized reporting, but we see that there may be some advantages actually for locals to be able to better describe what's happening in their basin. And also, as we mentioned, there will be some reporting that goes out to their constituents. And so, being able to provide their constituents with a little more information as to where the water specifically is coming from and how it's being managed might be helpful there too.
Any other questions or comments in the room related to those two final questions for topics 7 and 9? How about online? Okay, good. Thank you very much, Dan, and to those of you who provided excellent questions. We're going to move on to topic 8. And this topic is focused on state agency coordination. I'd like to invite Eric Ekdahl from the State Water Board to join the DWR panel to talk about coordination.
My name is Rich Jersich with the Department of Water Resources, so I'll kind of give an overview of this topic area, and then we can get into the questions after that. So the main kind of point behind this topic 8 issue paper that we have is that, SGMA does state in several places, there's a role for the department, and then there's a role for the State Water Board in terms of the actions and reviewing plans and determining if plans are meeting the requirements or not. And so we just want to kind of circle around on this issue and get feedback on concerns or questions about how the DWR and the State Water Board are working together, and to the extent and how far we take that coordination. So in general, there's parts of the code that require these newly formed groundwater sustainability agencies to support their plans to the department, and generally we have 2 years to review those plans. And then after reviewing them, we can actually recommend back to those sustainability agencies certain corrective actions. But the requirements also the department needs to consult with the State Water Board when we're making those determinations to make sure kind of both agencies are in agreement on the kind of the conditions and status of those plans. And then it comes down to at a point where we're reviewing plans and there's a probationary process there, and in that probationary process is kind of where the Water Board will take over in terms of reviewing plans and determining next steps. And again, in that area, particularly, if, for example, a area has not formed a groundwater sustainability agency by January or June of 2017, June 30th of 2017, that's one kind of off-ramp where the State Board may become involved. Or if they have submitted a plan, but then later in the review process, the department determines those plans are not adequate, that may be an off-ramp as well. So in terms of that process, the Water Board may come back to the department and ask us to do additional assessments related to those plans. And so that's another area where there's some needed consultation or coordination. Then the next part of this has to come with after the department has reviewed the plans and perhaps we've determined there are some deficiencies in those plans in terms of meeting the sustainability goal. Again, here, any action that, so it would, under the legislation, the board would step in under those cases, but the legislation also requires the board to consult with DWR about the potential local remedies. So there are options for the locals, even if they've been determined to be deficient, to come back and propose how they would come into compliance. And at that point, the board would also consult with the department on those opportunities. So in general, so that's kind of the gist of what we're getting at with this issue paper. In general, the feedback we've received so far from our advisory groups is really avoiding kind of a duplication of effort where the department would come out, ask for something in our regulations, and then at a later point, the Water Board would either ask for something else or completely different. And so trying to find consistency between kind of the roles of the two agencies. So that's the general feedback we've received so far. So just to get in the questions, to set that up, so given that there's these different roles for DWR and the Water Board for addressing these different concerns with the groundwater sustainability plans, are there particular concerns about that consultation, about how DWR and the Water Board will work with each other when it comes to reviewing and acting on those plans? So that's the first question.
So any thoughts, responses, questions related to possible concerns related to the coordination between DWR and the State Water Resources Control Board? Anyone in the room? And Tim, anything come in online? All right. Rich, would you like to continue?
Sure.
Thank you.
So another kind of key part of the coordination and consultation between our agencies is going to be related to data collection, data reporting, exchange of information, both what we're collecting, but also what we're asking these groundwater sustainability agencies to collect. And so one of the questions, and we've touched on this a little bit in the previous topics, but what are the key data sets that should be shared between DWR and the State Water Board to support evaluation of groundwater sustainability plans? So are there some key things that we recognize that we should be using basically the same information in our activities?
Okay, so we sort of asked this data sharing question from a different angle a moment ago. How about the data that should be shared between DWR and the State Board to support the evaluation of the groundwater sustainability plans? Thoughts, comments, questions pertaining to that question?
I'd say there's kind of a general expectation that we're using the same data, right? But are there circumstances where, you could see that perhaps we would not use the same data or might have different levels of accuracy or resolution that we would need?
Mm-hmm. Okay, anything come in online? Yes, we have a question or comment in the room.
I mean, doesn't the answer to that kind of go back to what you've been going through all along of the reality of each individual plan is going to be somewhat different and therefore might have different measurement points that are relative to its sustainability plan that may not be universally applicable and isn't, I mean, the challenge of this regulatory process is you're developing regulations for how you're going to evaluate an individual plan that the local government has the authority to develop. And they have a demonstration to prove that it's sustainable. And how do you measure that? And trying to come up with an absolute answer of what all that data is versus the flexibility for their experts to convince you the data they're submitting is accurate to measure their plan. And how you do that, I think, is probably the challenge. I don't know that anyone can sit here and say you're going to need absolutely this piece of data for everything or for a certain limited number. Just a general comment.
I would agree, and we do need to be flexible in how we're interacting with the local.
Anyone on the panel have anything to add? Okay, let's go to online. Anything come up around this, again, the coordination of data? All right, let's move on to this next question. What data are stakeholders already collecting and submitting to state agencies that could be included or leveraged by SGMA activities? And Rich, perhaps you can share with us the feedback you've received thus far.
Well, again, on this one, it is we recognize that there already is a lot of information being collected, whether it's through reporting for urban water management plans or agricultural water use reporting, and so we want to make sure we're capturing that when we're developing our requirements and how effectively we can coordinate what we're asking people to submit versus what they're already submitting under some other requirements. So if there are some key data sets that you already feel like you're already submitting to the state and that you don't want to see it again being submitted for a different purpose or how that can be coordinated with these other reporting requirements.
Any feedback there? Both first, I'll start in the room. Any feedback about everything and anything that's already being reported to various state agencies and how that can be leveraged? And how about online? Has anything come in? Okay.
Okay,
All
so
right. Rich, back to you.
Why don't we move on to the last question then? And this one has to do with just coordination again between federal, state, and local agencies. So, the state does provides technical support, and we are coordinating with other state agencies and federal agencies. So we do want to hear kind of what general sense of, to be successful under, SGMA, what types of, either data or other types of technical assistance or other assistance can DWR or the Water Board provide to help with that implementation of SGMA. Just as an example, one thing we're doing right now is providing support for facilitation services, so areas that are trying to form themselves into groundwater sustainability agencies. We're providing some facilitation support to help organize those efforts. So there are other things like that that would be useful for agencies, or there are specific data sets that would be useful.
Thank you. So any ideas, feedback, thoughts in the room about what DWR and the State Board can be doing to provide further assistance to GSAs as they or you implement SGMA? How about online? Okay. Is that it, Rich? Okay, thank you very much. We'll go ahead and have Trevor Joseph come back up to bring us through topic 10.
All right, thank you. So we're on the last topic paper. We've made it to the last topic paper. And we're trying to accomplish really two things in this topic paper. One, to talk about adaptive management, and then talk about what we're calling focus areas, which may be a little duplicative with what Dan described in terms of not a one-size-fits-all in terms of looking at data, spatial, temporal requirements, but it goes a little bit beyond that, and so I'll try to do that justice here in a minute. So adaptive management, how we're defining this is a process where planning objectives and or actions may be further developed, modified, or replaced based on the discovery of new knowledge in response to changing physical conditions or reduction of uncertainty. And so, adaptive management is obviously nothing new. Managers have been using this for who knows how long. We think there's some applicability here related to SGMA because SGMA does allow for, changing of some plan components. So we think we need to talk about it as it relates to regulations. So this is just a general process flow diagram that we got off the internet that describes kind of that adaptive management process. There's the planning process where you're determining management objectives and desired outcomes and performance indicators. A lot of that could be equated to SGMA in terms of obviously measurable objectives, interim milestones, actions. You're obviously setting up the plan. You move through that do phase and then evaluate and learn, and you make adjustments. So what we're talking though about with these adjustments is that potentially there's adjustments to the plan, and that's not shown here, but that's again, when there's adjustments to the plan, there's some applicability as it relates to these regulations, the department's involvement in terms of evaluating then any proposed changes to that plan. And so again, that's the reason why we want some input on adaptive management. The focus area, again, kind of a term we've coined that trying to get at this concept where groundwater managers would prioritize groundwater challenges in their groundwater sustainability plan area and focus monitoring, management, actions, projects, you name it, in the geographic areas of most need. So again, probably pretty intuitive. That's how we should operate, likely is to focus in on those areas of the most need. This shouldn't be confused with DWR trying to set up a system though where other areas are not monitored or managed. There we feel is important that there's a minimum standard, that there's monitoring in areas throughout the basin, but let's focus on the areas of most need, and we plan to set up the regulations in this matter. We've used the terms like tiered requirements related to water budgets and other components as it relates to the processes that Dan just briefly described that we didn't present today, but in terms of establishing significant and unreasonable levels, this might then equate to the process, and how locals define that, have different requirements in different areas and so forth and so on. So this is an important concept that we wanted to make sure folks are aware of before we start drafting regulations. So again, I'll kind of jump between maybe the two topics here, but citing sustainable groundwater management code that's relevant. A groundwater sustainable agency may periodically evaluate its GSP and assess conditions in the basin that may warrant modification of the plan or management objectives and may adjust to components in the plan. So again, that's the applicability of kind of an adaptive management process in SGMA. We're required to evaluate plans every 5 years and prepare an assessment. We also are going to be collecting the information annually that is submitted by GSAs. A lot of discussion with our advisory groups in terms of actually having some correspondence on an annual basis as opposed to just sending us data so that we can keep in contact and track things with GSAs for the purposes of potentially making the local agency making changes to their plans so that we're not surprised if conditions are changing, that your GSAs aren't surprised every 5 years if in fact we're not tracking with local agencies. So a lot of effort we feel should be evaluated or discussed related to annual discussions with local agencies. You may have seen this chart before. We presented this, I think, with batch 1 when we were talking about conceptually how GSAs to reach their sustainability goal will need to identify actions and all the different types of actions that may be used to reach sustainability. So here's what we're talking about as we're talking about adaptive management, and if agencies are changing actions to reach their measurable objectives, it'll be important to work with the department because that'll be potentially a change of their plan to reach sustainability. Again, this is another graphic from that first batch related to interim milestones. What we don't want with an adaptive management process is essentially redrawing or the line in the sand, so to speak, in terms of measurable objectives or interim milestones. That kind of activity we feel won't be allowed. So it's making sure that we or the local agencies have the data and the information necessary to warrant such a change to an objective or an interim milestone. The devil's in the detail here, but we'll have to lay this out in the regulations. So what I'm presenting here are stakeholder collected issues. So these are questions presented by other advisory groups or different stakeholders that we've met and related to this topic of adaptive management focus areas. One is, will flexibility exist in the implementation of plans, or will deficiencies immediately result in probationary status and deferment to the state board? That's a spelling error there. And you know, the answer there is, well, largely it depends. I mean, how we set up that process for adaptive management in the plans. What if there is not resources available to accomplish all the necessary objectives at the same time? Again, this gets to focus areas and how local agencies may be able to look at their issues in their basin, their area, and look at the requirements in the GSP regs and focus on accomplishing those things that are significant and unreasonable. And again, we think that will provide some flexibility in terms of their requirements, but again, it doesn't negate any of the requirements that will be in the regulations. And then what opportunity will GSAs have to adjust plans if regional conditions change? There will be an opportunity. SGMA provides for that, but again, that needs to be identified in the regulations in terms of how the department will evaluate potential changes in plans. Let's see. Adaptive management focus area considerations. These are more statements, obviously, and I think I may have touched on these. But again, adaptive management is not intended to provide a clear pathway to changing a sustainability goal itself. Rather, is intended to provide for modification to management objectives in light of new information. But again, that would need to be completely substantiated with good technical information. And again, we'd have to evaluate that. Let's see. And again, I think I'm repeating myself, but focus areas provide a mechanism to address the highest priority issues with limited resources. Again, I know we're not talking about the details today, but look for a process where there's different tiered requirements, and we think that that's an appropriate approach to developing regulations. So then these are the questions listed on the agenda, and we can start with these.
Okay, so looking at the first question here, how should groundwater sustainability plan regulations allow for inclusion of an adaptive management process? How should they allow for inclusion of an adaptive management process? Some ideas and feedback for the department on this question. First in the room, then we'll see if anything's come in from the webcast.
And so, because I'm not hearing anything, I can jump into the feedback that we've heard. One is, don't formalize an adaptive management process. Don't regulate the term adaptive management. Again, we feel that SGMA has a provision for changing plan considerations. So whether we call it adaptive management or something else, we do feel that we need to address this in the regulations. And then back to that annual correspondence, if you will, as opposed to just a 5-year assessments. There's a feedback here that adaptive management should allow for quicker adjustments to GSPs as long as they are reported in the annual report. And I'm not sure if we're looking for yearly updates to GSPs, if that's the appropriate approach. I don't think that might be the best use for all of our time, but I think that annual correspondence and working with local agencies to understand what's needed from the local agency perspective in terms of potential plan changes is important. So again, that gets to kind of a annual correspondence with local agencies.
So has any of this feedback jogged any responses or ideas in the room? Any thoughts on the feedback received from the advisory groups? How about online? Anything come in? Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next question.
So then this question gets to potential changes to measurable objectives or actions. If through the adaptive management process, a GSA wishes to change a measurable objective and or action, what type of data information may be necessary to support such a change? Pretty broad question, but wanting to understand where locals are and the public stakeholders on potential changes to measurable objectives and actions.
Why don't you go on to the feedback you received so far, and then we'll put it out to the group.
So one comment here is specifically about the interim, the 5-year interim plan should demonstrate the actions taken and how they relate to data. So, and I think what's meant by that is the 5-year assessments that there should be substantial data, I guess, in those every 5 years. That's where that would be, that information would be encapsulated, I guess, to make a change. The process needs to accommodate changes that occur due to measurements and modeling results. So here, obviously, or it looks like there's some support for really some good analysis, i.e. in modeling, to substantiate a change. And I think, measurements that could be pretty broad in terms of just general data, but I think modeling certainly is, especially numerical modeling, would be a good tool to substantiate potential changes to objectives or how groundwater is going to be used and what actions could be reformulated to meet those objectives.
So any other ideas about what types of data or information would be necessary to make a change to a measurable objective or an action in a GSP, in addition to the feedback received by the advisory groups? Yes.
It's not so much what additional data, it's how the data you're going to be collecting is going to be used to demonstrate you're meeting the objectives. I mean, we've had basin management objectives and the concept that's been applied well in some places, not as well or even ignored in others. It's adaptive management can be built into it by putting triggers into your plan that say and anticipating that and saying, if these conditions are met, then we take these actions. That makes your plan immediately actionable and can give you some sense of not only fiscal needs out into the future, but the things you might encounter on the way. So thinking it all the way through. Include triggers in your plan would be my suggestions, and tie those back to those measurable objectives.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. And triggers is something that we've listed in that, I believe it was discussion paper 2. We do feel that that's a good planning mechanism, will be likely needed to manage to thresholds. Thank you for the comment.
Thank you. Anything come in via the webcast? Okay.
All right, and then that other topic here, focus areas, kind of a broad topic, but how should GSP regulations consider this concept of focus areas, if at all? Again, I think we heard on, not to paraphrase, but one of the emails related to Dan's presentation, maybe some concerns about having lower resolution data in certain areas of the basin. That, again, we're not stating that certain areas of the basin could be removed from monitoring requirements. There will likely be a minimum standard, but again, we feel that flexibility, it's pretty intuitive in our minds that there should be a tiered or different requirements in different areas of the basin, certainly based on the types of undesirable results or level of significant and unreasonable in the basin. So again, probably an intuitive concept for many, but we just wanted to get this across that we do think this is important to create tiered requirements in different focus areas and allow for that in the regulations.
And do you want to share some of that feedback? Yeah.
So one comment is, GSAs are likely to use this concept of focus areas, but recommended that the information is not lost if reported in an aggregated fashion. And so as Dan showed in one of his slides, the annual data reporting requirements, so those 5 or 6 items, it certainly doesn't get into detail in terms of what focus area reporting would look like. So if there was a focus area type of process, the department would need to see data in such a way that we can see how it's being collected within each of those focus areas, and so not lost in some sort of aggregated reporting format. And let's see, vulnerabilities will drive importance of greater data resolution in the focus areas. And again, I think that just gets to, this is kind of a natural way to approach things from a local agency or a management perspective, I should say. But again, we just want to make sure that we're being transparent and that we're in support of this type of approach, and setting things up in this way in the regulations is highly likely.
Any thoughts or questions related to the concept of focus areas? Anything come via the webcast?
Yes, we have a few. This one reaches back to the adaptive management concept. A comment, I would like to see the regulations specify that GSAs include a review and revision procedure in their GSPs rather than having the regulations be prescriptive. However, I think the regulations have a minimum review period and maybe deviance allowance before GSA moves into revision procedures. Another comment, this one straight to the point here, it will become necessary to have some ideas of how big of a change is worthy of an action, either to increase or decrease some action. So how big of a change over what temporal or interspatial time or trigger will be important. So looking at adaptive management and probably both focus areas there. Another comment towards GSAs. If 2 or more GSAs want to have an overlap and have a coordination plan to cover the overlap, is that overlap still allowed? Can you respond to that?
Yeah, so that would be looking at SB 13, and I can't legally interpret that for the questioner, but I would suggest that they read that document carefully and seek their own legal counsel's interpretation. But on the face of it, it looks like overlap is not allowed.
And I guess this is the last comment here regarding focus areas. I would be concerned that focus areas may be detrimental to disadvantaged communities. So I would like to see significant outreach to all the disadvantaged communities throughout the basin when a GSA is considering focus areas within the basin.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, any final questions or comments related to any of the topics that have been discussed today before we go into closing remarks? Next steps and schedule. So any comments or questions based on any of these topics today? Well, please do go to the SGM website and take a look at those issue papers, and there's a whole other swath of information there. Thank you.
Great. So next steps, As mentioned previously, we're in the second phase of drafting framework, if you will, drafting these discussion papers. These documents are all draft. We do not intend to finalize these 10 discussion papers that we've presented and talked through this summer. If you're interested, though, in providing us comments on these, please continue to send us information through our email list, and I'll show that on the next slide. We would appreciate comments just because we're passing the second phase soon into the third phase of drafting emergency regulations. We can still use information obtained through this process, so don't hesitate. But as I mentioned, we'll be moving to the third phase here soon, drafting emergency regulations. We hope to have draft emergency regulations out in the December-January timeframe. This shows that process going a little bit further because then this triggers then a mandatory 3 public meetings after we've posted the regulations, the draft emergency regulations on our website after a 30-day period. Hopefully we'll be evaluating all of those comments early next calendar year and working to finalize them and pull together some final emergency regulations for groundwater sustainability plans before the June 1st, 2016 deadline. So again, I appreciate all the comments and information we've received. You know, this is one advisory group, if you will, and we have 11 others. And so we've received comments through all 12, if you will, including this public meeting and webcast, which has been hugely advantageous to us through the basin boundary emergency regulation process. And we're already using this input and working through some concepts on the draft emergency regulations, and we'll be writing feverishly this fall and winter to make our deadlines. So thanks again for your support this summer, and we'll see you again, I'm sure, in early next year with these public meetings.
Thank you all for coming today. Enjoy the rest of your evening.